Okay, I don't know at what point this is live. I think it's live. I think it's live. Cale, I think we're live. Right.
Great.
Hello to everybody that's watching this. This is a live broadcast coming to you from Dublin. We're going to be talking about vaccines. But in particular, we're going to be talking about the COVID-19 vaccines, what vaccines are out there. We're going to address a couple of issues. We're going to be talking about vaccine hesitancy and skepticism. We're going to be talking about, we might get into pregnancy and lactation and vaccines and some of the wording around that. We're not going to try and interpret that. We're just going to basically tell you what's out there in terms of advice. To start off with, let's jump in and I'll introduce myself. My name is Greg Martin. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a public health doctor working in Dublin in Ireland. And with me, we've got Cale. Cale, will you introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, my name's Dr. Cale Lawlor. I work with Greg, one of his colleagues. I am also a medical doctor, bit of a background in public health and currently working in public health. So back to you, Greg.
And Cale's one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. I'm just putting that in there, Cale, just so that people know. Right. Okay, let's jump right in. What we're going to cover a couple of things, right? We're going to talk about the idea of herd immunity, right? People don't always understand that. We're going to try and explain that a little bit in a nutshell. We're going to talk about vaccine hesitancy and skepticism and some of the kind of crazy conspiracy theories that are out there, and just basically talk about how ridiculous that stuff is. We're going to compare some of the existing vaccines that are out there. So we're going to talk about Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca. We're going to also talk about the Russian and the Chinese vaccines. There's many more that are in the pipeline. We're not going to get into absolutely everything. We're certainly going to try and cover the big stuff, the stuff that's important, the stuff that's current, the things that if you're out there and you might be actually in the pipeline to get one of these vaccines in the short term. So you might want to know a little bit about them. We're going to talk about them. We're going to compare them, look at positives, negatives, et cetera, et cetera. We might get into a little bit about pregnancy and breastfeeding. We might, if we've got time, talk about the strategies that some countries are adopting, which is to delay the second dose. And there's more than one reason for adopting that strategy, but there's also some concerns and risks associated with that. And I think it's worth talking about and putting on the table for discussion. Now, you might be watching this video as a recorded version on YouTube or on LinkedIn, because we're doing this live, but the actual video will exist sort of in perpetuity. So if you're watching this on YouTube, my usual message is subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification if you want to get notifications of future videos. And of course, you can join the channel as a member if you want to get involved with discussions about jobs in the global health and the public health space. If you're watching this live, hello, good to have you with us. If you're watching this live, please do push the share button to try and get more people in this, because it's going to be quite fun. It's also going to be interactive. So you can write comments or questions, and those questions will pop up on the screen, and we'll try and respond to those comments and questions, right? This is, incidentally, this is the first time I've done this. So when I say the questions will pop up onto the screen, I kind of just, I think they will. But we haven't done this before. This is the first time. So hoping everything works as the way it should, but do participate, send in your questions. We'll try and respond. Now, a little caveat, you might ask a question and we might not know the answer. If that happens, we'll just say so, because neither of us are vaccines experts. We're just interested people. We're people that are working in public health, so we believe in vaccines, but we won't necessarily know the answers to all of your questions. If we don't know the answer, we're just going to tell you, and that's you just have to live with that. But if we do, or if we can provide some kind of an intelligent response, we'll do our very best. What do you say to that, Cale? Are we going to do our best?
Good. Yes, that's all we can do.
Exactly. Okay. Now.
Well, I might get the ball rolling there, Greg, if that's all right.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier, obviously, herd immunity. So I'd like to hear a bit more about herd immunity, and also, what that has to do with the R0 number and reproductive number that we always hear about.
The good old R0 and reproductive number. Okay, well, look, the point of any vaccine program is to get us to herd immunity. And let's just kind of understand what that is. Herd immunity is the point at which enough people have got immunity to a particular disease or a particular virus or bacteria, so that there isn't ongoing transmission in the community and everybody's protected. So not absolutely everybody has to have immunity. You just need a critical mass, a certain number of people that are immune for everyone to be protected. And under those circumstances, an epidemic or a pandemic will usually just burn out and go away by itself. And let's talk a little bit about how you get to that. Now, then there's a particular number, there's a way of calculating what proportion of society needs to be immune in order to have herd immunity. There have been, in the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been some countries that have talked about kind of getting to herd immunity by allowing for natural infection in the community. There's a few reasons why that's a terrible idea. Firstly, the sheer number of people that would have to get infected and get sick in order for us to get to herd immunity through natural infection would be vast. In Ireland, for example, we've got about 5 million people that live here. We'd need about 3 million people to get sick in order for us to get to herd immunity. And we don't even know if at that point we'd get to herd immunity, because we don't know for how long following an infection you retain an immune response, right? So it's a huge gamble, firstly. Secondly, the other reason why it's a terrible idea is if you allow a disease like this to simmer around in the background and be there for too long, you're giving the virus opportunity and time to mutate. And new versions of that virus may be, and we're seeing that already. We're seeing new versions of this virus already. We're seeing a version from the UK, a South African variant. These things are more transmissible. And there's questions around whether or not the South African version is in fact has components within it that might allow it to evade the immune system to an extent, which means you could get reinfections in people that have been previously infected, and there may be, it might be less susceptible to a vaccine, but we don't, these are all questions that are just being asked. We don't really know the facts around that. But so waiting for herd immunity through natural infection is a big mistake. What we want to do is get to herd immunity by vaccinating people, right? Vaccines are the answer. That's the way forwards. How does it work? Well, this is, how do we get to the number? How do we know how many people need to be vaccinated in order to get to herd immunity? Well, so there's a formula, and I'll tell you what the formula is, but then I'm going to tell you why you don't need to remember the formula. The formula is R0 minus 1 divided by R0 times 100. Now, you don't need to remember that, and the reason is this. It actually makes perfect sense. You can work it out. R0 is the number of people that would be infected if everybody was susceptible. So nobody's been infected, nobody's got a vaccine. If you had one person with the vaccine, with the disease, how many additional people would catch it? Let's take an example. Let's take measles. If you have a person with measles, they would typically, in a completely susceptible community, they would transmit that onto 16 other people. That depends a little bit on there's a lot of factors. That's not the case everywhere, but let's say in a certain society with certain parameters, it would be about 16 people. Right, we want to get to a point where every person with, in this case, measles, transmits it to less than one other person. In other words, the threshold that we're looking for is how many people need to be immune so that a person with measles transmits it only to one other person, right? That's the threshold. And if we have any more immunity after that, we know that we've passed herd immunity and the disease will burn out. Right, so let's make some sense of this. If R0 is 16, and that means 16 people will get the disease. What proportion of those 16 need to be immune so that only one person gets sick? Well, 15 of the 16 need to be immune. In other words, 16 minus 1, R0 minus 1, divided by R0, 16. So 15 of the 16 times 100 equals herd immunity. And in the case of the measles vaccine, I think that's about 96%. And in the case of COVID-19, assuming an R0 of 2, I think it works out to be about 60%, 60 to 70%, depending on what the R0 is exactly. I can't do the calculations in my head. That's the number of people that need to be immune. And then you need to take into account that a vaccine is not 100% effective, although the vaccines that are out there are extremely effective, and we'll talk about that. So you need to vaccinate slightly more than 60 to 70% of the population. And I think obviously what we want to go for is as high a number as possible. Okay, so my question to you, Cale, is does what I just said make sense? It made sense to me, but I know I was jabbering on a little bit there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Basically, you're saying the more infectious the disease, the more people you need to vaccinate to achieve herd immunity.
Yep, that's a good summary.
Yeah. I think something very important as well, and we've talked about this kind of informally at work, is that the amount of, like, it's not just about, inevitably you can let that infection spread in a relatively healthy population, but what is kind of unknown at the moment is the long-term effects, even on a young population, of getting a COVID infection. They might not have the mortality outcomes, but they might have very significant long-term disability that we just don't know about yet.
Absolutely. And that's actually something that's making me a little bit nervous. As we roll out the vaccine, we're going to get to a point where people in the nursing homes and the elderly and the vulnerable people and the healthcare workers are all vaccinated. And under those circumstances, you may find that society in general, especially younger people, kind of take a little bit more of a relaxed view of all of the restrictions and public health guidelines, because the argument we've been making all along is You need to do all the right things because we're trying to protect the vulnerable. We're trying to protect the elderly. And then it's not unreasonable to think that they will think, well, the elderly and the vulnerable and the healthcare workers are all now protected. They've been vaccinated. They were kind of high on the priority list. We can now kind of relax a little bit and have a slightly a less stringent approach to the restrictions and public health guidelines. And the problem with that is that, as you pointed out, you've got this long COVID, you've got young people that get COVID-19 that land up with problems like chronic fatigue that can last for a long period of time. And we know that a small percentage, even of young people, end up getting a severe illness. And if enough people in the population, even in that population, get sick, you could actually start filling up the ICU beds with young people. So we need to continue to be vigilant with respect to public health guidelines, even in the context of a vaccine program that's been rolled out. Now, Cale, question for you. You come from Australia. And obviously, we love Australians. You guys are great. I mean, I've got questions about cricket and rugby, but that's a different conversation. But it's certainly a country where there have been, let's call it, a lot of alternative beliefs and conspiracy theories. Can you just give us a little bit of a window in on your thoughts? What do you think's led to that? Is there where does all of this come from? This conspiracy theory type thinking?
Yeah, it's very interesting. People can believe and buy into conspiracy theories for all sorts of reasons. I think it's very important to realize that even if people, are believing in conspiracy theories, it's normally not from a place of malice that they're doing this. It's genuine concern that, about them, about their safety, about the safety of the people they love, that makes them buy into these conspiracy theories. So I think that's important. But generally, it comes with all different types of societies and cultures. I think we've recently had a survey here and across Europe kind of into vaccine hesitancy, and the rates are different in Europe. Ireland has quite a high rate of people saying they would accept a vaccine, whereas France is a lot lower. A lot of different things play into it. It can be kind of a distrust of what we call Western medicine. It can be a distrust of general authority. Can be just kind of not that much involvement just in the scientific community, maybe just subscribing to certain media outlets. Media outlets can be extremely influential in how people think about themselves and their society and their culture. So it is, it's such a variety of things. It's really interesting, though. Back in 2016, a guy named David Grimes published a study called "On the Variability of Conspirational Belief." A few interesting words in there. Basically, he applied a mathematical formula to conspiracy theories and found that the bigger and the more weighty the conspiracy theory, the faster it'll break down, essentially. So the more important it is, it's prone to eventually destroy itself. So he worked out from his mathematical equations that you would need to keep a secret, to keep a conspiracy secret for 5 years, you need 2,500 people to keep that secret. For 10 years, you need 1,000 people. So you can see that the longer you go in time, the less people there are that are going to be able to keep the secret, essentially.
Right. So would an example of that, Cale, be like, for example, there's a conspiracy theory out there that Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation have invented this COVID-19 disease in order for, they're in collusion with Big Pharma, and it's all about trying to sell products to people. So they needed to invent a disease. Or there's another one out there that, of course, the vaccine is going to come with a microchip that gets implanted in you. So when you get vaccinated, you get a microchip and you're going to be followed around indefinitely. Now, in order for that kind of conspiracy to work, if there was any validity to it, everybody working in those organizations would need to keep that secret. And you're talking about ultimately thousands and thousands and thousands of people, everybody at the Gates Foundation, everybody at Big Pharma, just these thousands of people all keeping absolutely secret all of the time over years and years and years. And eventually it just becomes obviously ridiculous.
Yeah, it's too big to handle. There's actually a great quote from that paper. One of the major motivations is to help counteract anti-science beliefs from gaining a foothold by quantifying how extraordinarily unlikely it is that a cohesive scientific fraud could take place on such massive scales.
Yeah.
And, if you were thinking about microchips in vaccines, you would need thousands upon thousands of people all around the globe with seemingly no cares in the world except for their own advancement and, for the government, whoever's controlling this microchip, only focusing on their advancement. It's a bit much.
No, it is all quite bizarre. I mean, something that I think drives some conspiracy theory. I don't think. I mean, this has been very well documented. Is in 2012, YouTube was the first social media platform to start putting recommended videos. So you're watching a particular video, and it would stick a recommended video on the side, and that recommendation would come off sort of an AI algorithm that would, and it was designed to optimize the extent to which you would stay watching YouTube, right? So its objective, the algorithm's objective, is to choose recommendations and suggestions that would keep you engaged on YouTube, right? And then subsequently other social media platforms followed suit and did the same thing. What they didn't expect is that if you make a recommendation, if a person's watching a video on a particular sort of in the middle of the road idea, if you recommend to them something that's a little bit bizarre, that's likely to catch their attention more than something that's a little bit more mainstream. And so you can be in the middle, you can be a middle of the road thinker, and there's been lots of examples of this that have been studied. For example, teenage girls that do a search and watch a video on dieting, the algorithm figured out that if after dieting they showed them a video that sort of glamorized anorexia, they were more likely to watch that than if there was a video suggested that was about this is how to eat healthy fruits and vegetables. And so there was a tendency to, and then once you've watched a video about one kind of slightly off-center idea, the next step would be something more crazy. And then before you know it, you're watching QAnon videos and you believe that the world is flat. And you know what I mean? And it was just coincidence that flat earth videos do better than a video by Carl Sagan about the wonders of the universe. And so society at large, millions and millions of people keep watching more and more crazy stuff. And so if you're on YouTube and you're watching this, keep watching this.
Sure.
Don't watch the crazy crap that YouTube is suggesting to you right now. And I hope YouTube's not listening. Now, they're aware of this problem. I've watched and listened to podcasts where this has been discussed at length.
Yeah.
But I mean, conspiracy theories have been around for ages. In the 14th century, people believed that Jewish people were responsible for the bubonic plague. In 1890, there was a newspaper article that claimed that electric light bulbs were the cause of influenza. And there's a nice little parallel, because nowadays you're finding people that are saying that the 5G cell phone network is the cause of COVID-19. Of course, in the Spanish flu, 1918, there was a conspiracy theory that the pharma company Bayer had put the Spanish flu into aspirin, which of course is absolute rubbish. In 1998, Wakefield published this paper suggesting that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And we know definitively, I mean, this has been looked at extensively, we know that that's not true. And looking more closely at Wakefield's data, it is now more recently been identified that not only was he wrong, but that the data was falsified. So it was a lie all along, and he and his co-authors knew it and published anyway. 2004, I remember in Nigeria, there were religious clerics that were saying that the polio vaccine had anti-fertility drugs in it. And so polio vaccination stopped across the entire country. And of course, there was polio sprung up and then crossed a number of borders very, very quickly. So, the idea of microchips in your arm when you get the COVID-19 vaccine, of course, it's rubbish. The idea that the vaccine is going to change your DNA, of course, it's rubbish. You just need to know a little bit about the biology of how these vaccines work to know that that is absolute rubbish. But these ideas get an enormous amount of traction on the internet, and is quite worrying. Question for you, Cale: how many of your family members have died recently of smallpox?
Zero,
right?
Yep.
Zero, because vaccines work. Smallpox was eradicated in 1980. But even in the century that smallpox was eradicated, so last century, so before it was eradicated, just to give you a sense of how bad smallpox was, this is just a message to anybody out there that sort of thinks, well, vaccines are a bit of a waste of time. Last century, smallpox killed 300 million people. In the century that it was eradicated, and there was a vaccine program getting rolled out, and the numbers were dropping, still 300 million people died. And since 1980, there hasn't been a single case of smallpox. Of course, there's similar stories around polio. Polio is not eradicated yet, but I mean, we're aiming at that. Measles today, measles still kills about 140,000 people every year, and that is almost entirely in populations with low vaccine coverage. And so there's a real incentive to increase vaccine coverage and save those people's lives.
We've got some interesting questions coming along here. Obviously, a lot of them are about the vaccines, which we'll get to, but a very talented doctor friend of mine, Gillian, has just messaged in and said, science has become a dirty word to many conspiracy theorists. How can we break the polarization down? Greg, any particular thoughts on that?
Wow. I mean, there was this idea in sort of science communication that all you need to do is give people the facts, and eventually they'll kind of see through the noise and they'll come around. And I think that notion has been demonstrated to be ineffective. We need to not only have the facts, but we need to find better and better ways of communicating, better and better ways of empathizing with people that have got strange and wayward ideas, understand what where it is that these strange ideas come from, and try and address them at the roots, communicate better. We need to be honest. So if there's things we don't know, we just need to be upfront and say that we don't know. It's an ongoing struggle. I listened to a podcast, which, by the way, I highly recommend, called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And they talk about this all the time. I mean, it is a weekly part of their conversation about how do we communicate better so as to not just shout at the conspiracy theorists and say, like, you guys are wrong, but actually kind of bring the truth in a way that is palatable and makes sense and kind of wins people over. But it's not easy. I mean, on the vaccine front, there's some people that are vaccine skeptics that just don't believe in vaccines at all, ever. And they also tend to be people, because we know this, having studied it, they tend to be people that buy into other conspiracy theories, right? So there's people that just buy into conspiracy theories in general. They're a very difficult bunch to change, right? These are people, because their way of thinking is not falsifiable. If you provide them with evidence, they will build that into the conspiracy theory. So even the evidence is more evidence of people conspiring to create a narrative that's counter to theirs. So it's very difficult to convince anybody with that kind of mindset that they're wrong. However, in the spectrum of beliefs, right, with respect to vaccines, there are people that aren't necessarily vaccine skeptics, but are vaccine hesitant. In other words, they don't have wayward ideas. They're just people that sort of think they've heard things about vaccines. They're not sure. They're not scientists, and they're a little bit concerned. But with the right information, by giving them and pointing them to evidence-based literature or research, or providing them with information about the science, they can actually have their concerns put at ease. And that's the group we really need to identify and communicate with quite proactively.
And where we work, Greg, in Ireland, there's been a lot of work around that in preparation for the COVID vaccine. There's been wide-scale surveys that look at where people are on that spectrum, and a lot of the documentation that we have coming out is about taking away that tension between science and anti-science, if you will. It's about allowing people to make informed decision and saying quite clearly, we don't know everything, but this is what we know.
Yeah,
I think taking away that tension is kind of what you said as well. Empathizing with people and trying to understand where they're coming from, because again, it's not normally, it's not from a place of malice.
Yeah. And there's a big chunk of people out there who are on the fence. They don't have strong feelings one way or the next, and they just need to kind of get the right information and be communicated with in a way that's effective. And we need to keep in mind that the other side of this argument are trying to proactively communicate with those people too, right? So there is a little bit of a battle for the hearts and minds that we need to, engage with. The anti-vax community are extremely mobilized. They're very animated. They're all over YouTube. They're very slick. They're well rehearsed. They have phrases that are kind of quite emotive. If you go into YouTube and you start watching some of these videos, I watch them just to kind of get a sense of what's out there. And you have these people sort of talking about, oh, I live in a vaccine-free family, and they paint it as such a beautiful, wonderful thing. And everybody in our family is healthy and eats organic food. And, we hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And it sounds very appealing. But in actual fact, it's not based on the truth. It's not based on science. But it is based on a mindset that, as you pointed out, Cale, isn't isn't malicious. It's just, they genuinely are misinformed. Any other questions? Well, before we jump into a comparison of the big vaccines.
Well, yeah, a lot of the people. Hello, everyone. A lot of familiar names. A lot of people have been asking about kind of different vaccine contraindications, risks. Autoimmune disease, and attenuated viruses versus mRNA viruses. Vaccines. Sorry. So yeah, we'll definitely get into that. I don't know. Do you want to talk at all about aerosolization of COVID, or do you want to jump into vaccines? I don't know. It's up to you.
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't I hit the three big vaccines now, because it might just off the bat deal with a lot of the questions that people have. Absolutely. And just keep in mind, people with questions, that there's obviously going to be stuff that you're asking that I'm not able to answer, and Cale won't be able to answer. I mean, we're not going to know everything, but we'll tell you what we do know, and we can point you in the right direction and let you know where to find out more. But let's talk about these three vaccines that are being rolled out as we speak. So, this is mid-January 2021. 3 vaccines are now kind of licensed, depending on where you are. But in some shape or form, they're licensed in certain parts of the world. There's the Pfizer vaccine, there's Moderna, and there's the AstraZeneca vaccine, or sometimes called the Oxford vaccine. And let's just get our heads around these 3, and then I think Cale will talk a little bit about the Russian and Chinese vaccine as well. So the Pfizer vaccine, right? mRNA vaccine. So is Moderna. Pfizer and Moderna, both mRNA vaccines. How that works is they package some mRNA, some of the code that describes how it is that a particular protein needs to be built. They package it in a little lipid envelope, and they send it into the body. Now, it doesn't join your DNA and change your DNA and turn you into a mutant. All it does is it unfolds within the cytoplasm of your cell and uses the machinery of your cell to build up tiny little spike proteins. And it's not the whole COVID-19 virus. It's a tiny little part of the virus called the spike protein, and it builds those little spike proteins so that your immune system sees the proteins and develops a response to them, so that when the real virus comes along, there's already an army of immunoglobulins and B cells ready to kind of to mount a response. Right, that's the mRNA. The AstraZeneca virus is different. It uses a viral vector, and I think it's correct me if I'm wrong, Cale, but it is the AstraZeneca. I think it's the adenovirus.
Yeah,
so
I think so too, yeah.
It takes a little snippet of the SARS-CoV-2, that's the virus that causes COVID-19, sticks it into this benign virus, sends that into the body, and the same process really takes place. It uses that little bit of RNA and proteins are built up, and your body mounts an immune response. And so that's how it works. The beauty of this mRNA, it's a new technology, so we haven't used this before, but the beauty of it is it's extremely quick to develop a vaccine. So from the point that the Chinese made, because the virus was identified in China, China made the RNA sequence available to everybody very early on. I think it was in January they made it available. You could download it off the internet. Moderna had developed a vaccine within 48 hours of that code being available. Like literally over a weekend, they could make a vaccine. The reason that that's really exciting, because it's so quick and easy. I mean, they just kind of assemble it. The reason making a vaccine using mRNA is so exciting is you could also make variations and changes to vaccines very quickly if you needed to. I mean, I don't know enough about the licensing process that may slow things down a little bit, but let's say, for example, we identified that, for example, the South African variant evaded the immune system in this way or that way. A new version of the vaccine could be developed extremely quickly that addressed that problem, right? And we'd need to make sure that it was safe and effective, et cetera, et cetera. But creating a new vaccine using this technology is absolutely phenomenal. In terms of efficacy, now quickly, the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is in the context of a trial. Effectiveness is in the context of real life, right? That's just in a nutshell. But in terms of efficacy, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine are kind of up there in the 95% in terms of the extent to which they'll protect you from getting disease. Now, I'm emphasizing that because there's something in that that's worth talking about. At this point in time, there isn't evidence that these vaccines protect you from getting an asymptomatic infection and potentially passing it on to somebody else. However, 2 million people have already been vaccinated in Israel, and data from studies done in that community. It does seem as if the vaccination program, in fact, doesn't just prevent disease and symptoms, but actually prevents onward spread and transmission. So, which is great news. It means these vaccines are really going to affect the R value and bring and have a huge impact on the pandemic. So we've got Pfizer and Moderna hitting the sort of 90 in the mid 90s in terms of efficacy. The Oxford vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine seems to be less effective, 62% more or less, which incidentally is still good. I mean, 90% is amazing. 62% is still really good. What was interesting about the trial with AstraZeneca vaccine is that there was a little branch of it in which they accidentally gave half of the correct dose as the first dose, and then the full dose as the second dose. And in that subgroup, it was a coincidental finding. They found that the efficacy was up to 90%. And there is, from an immunological point of view, there are like biologically sound reasons why that might be the case. So it could be, I mean, and so they're redoing that science, by the way. They're going to look at that very closely. It could be that the AstraZeneca vaccine in reality lands up with an efficacy of in the 90s as well, which would be amazing. And there's all sorts of other reasons why the Oxford vaccine is fantastic. I mean, and I'm going to get into that in just a second. Well, we'll quickly talk about that now. Shipping and transport, right? The Pfizer vaccine has to be shipped at minus 70 degrees, right, centigrade. That's really, really cold. It's difficult. You're not going to have freezers that can get down to that temperature all over the country. It creates a storage problem. The Moderna vaccine also needs to be cold, but it can be stored for 6 months at minus 20 degrees Celsius. So that's cold, but it's not minus 70. It can live for about 30 days at temperatures of about a household fridge, and it can live for 12. It's still useful for 12 hours at room temperature. So the Moderna vaccine is a little bit more user-friendly in terms of getting it out there. The other difference between the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine with respect to getting it out into places is the Pfizer vaccine comes in trays of 975 doses. The Moderna vaccine, 100 doses. And the reason that's important is because 975 doses is a lot, and not every venue that you're going to want to get this vaccine out into will have the demand for that many doses, and the balance could land up being wasted. Whereas if you can distribute things in increments of 100, you can get a much more precise number of vaccines into the places that you're trying to get it. The Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, no need to keep it at minus 70 degrees. You can transport it in refrigeration vans or cooler boxes. 2 degrees to 8 degrees centigrade is fine. You just need to protect it from light. And the other interesting thing about the AstraZeneca and the Oxford vaccine is that so far there's been no incidences of anaphylactic reactions at all, which means that you don't need to wait the 15 minutes once you've been vaccinated at this stage. And that means that the pipeline can flow much more fast. And part of this battle is to get this thing done quickly. So the Oxford vaccine, you can get it all over the place. You don't need to have these fancy fridges. You can vaccinate people and send them on their way, and you can have the pipeline moving much more quickly. So the other thing, of course, is the Oxford vaccine is much, much cheaper. And that's a biggie, right? I mean, at the moment, the Pfizer vaccine, I think is about $20. The Moderna about $38, and the Oxford vaccine is $4. That's the price of a cup of coffee. That's huge, and especially when we're talking about getting this vaccine into low-income settings. On that note, Cale, challenges with respect to getting the virus. Well, okay, let's get back to challenges in low-income settings. First, tell us about the Russian and the Chinese vaccine, and then we're going to come back to low-income settings.
Sure. So yeah, the Gamaleya Institute in Russia has developed a vaccine which they've called Sputnik 5.
Why Sputnik? Where does that come from?
It's a bit of a funny one, I think, because Sputnik
does it relate to the satellite, I imagine?
Yeah. Sputnik was the first satellite in space, and at the time, it was obviously during the Cold War. The Russians were very proud that or Soviets were very proud they could put the first satellite in space. So I think this was one of the first vaccines that was actually licensed and registered. We'll get a bit into that, but I think it was, the Russians saying, look, we've done it again. We've beaten everyone again. Yeah. Sputnik 5 it is. So the Sputnik...
I think that is what happened.
The Sputnik vaccine has a reported efficacy of 91.4%, so also very high up with Pfizer and Moderna. And even from a single dose, it kind of could be up to 73 to 85% is reported. And like the Oxford vaccine, it is a modified adenovirus. So the protein for coronavirus within it, and it gets injected in the body, and then the body builds the immune response. There's been quite a few trials in a lot of different countries, and so far Russia is supplying the vaccine to a number of countries. Russia, Belarus, a lot of parts of South America, and parts of Asia, and 1.5 million doses have been given so far. And there's actually trials to see if you give one dose of Sputnik 5 and one dose of AstraZeneca, if that gives you a better immune response and a better protection against COVID-19. So that will be in the coming months, I guess. We'll find out that.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. The ability to swap and change between vaccines, and I, in talking to and listening to immunologists, the instinct that they have is that that's not going to be a problem at all. Is that it's likely that you're going to be able to take one vaccine as your first dose and a different vaccine as your second dose, which from a logistics and supply chain management point of view may be extremely important.
Absolutely. And speaking of the logistics, again, this is a 2 to 8 degrees storage vaccine. So obviously you don't need that super cold supply chain to be able to...
easy to get it around. I wonder if, because it was a sort of adenovirus vaccine with a snippet of a spike protein stuck in there, I wonder if they just, because the Russians, of course, rolled this thing out before everybody else considered the science behind it to be robust. And it might be that they just sort of thought, look, it's very likely that this is going to work, and we're just going to roll this thing out and let the science come from sort of, in the field, real life vaccination programs. And I think that's kind of what they've done. I think, most people watching it from the outside looking in kind of felt it was an unnecessarily risky approach, because with vaccines, it is important that we make sure that we've got the safety and efficacy nailed down before we do anything. So they took a bit of a chance, but it seems to be a gamble that paid off.
Yeah. And in the case of Sputnik, actually, the government approved it when there was only a small trial.
Tiny trial.
Minuscule. So then that has ended up creating hesitancy because people were not really confident in the science. And now also when the bigger, large trials are happening now in Russia, there's like 40,000 people kind of enrolled, but the vaccine is quite widely available. So people are dropping out thinking they're placebos and actually just getting what they know is the vaccine.
Right. Why would you be part of a trial when, if you're part of a trial, you've got a 50% chance of just getting a placebo? When you'd prefer to just get the vaccine. Yeah.
That's a few controversies there, but all these things unfortunately just take time, months.
What about the Chinese vaccine? What's the story there?
So again, bit of a funny one. So there's two. The main one is called CoronaVac, and it's developed by a group called Sinovac Biotech in Beijing. So far, there's been a lot of discrepancy in the trial data about the efficacy. So Brazil has just completed a large-scale trial, and they found the efficacy just, I think it was earlier this week or maybe late last week, to be 50.4%, which won't meet the criteria really for large-scale licensing by the WHO or by Brazil. But this is varies quite a lot around the world. So Turkey did a trial with this vaccine as well and found 91.3%. Brazil initially found 78%, but then they included other data. And Indonesia has found 65.3%. So there is quite a lot of discrepancy, and a lot of people look at the discrepancy and go, well, why is this being hidden? Like, what is being hidden? And we don't have the answers to that either, really. But the Brazil trial was quite large. And obviously Brazil has a lot of motivation in licensing something that they trust, and they found 50%. But otherwise, it's quite a stable vaccine, actually. Again, it can be stored at 2 to 8 degrees, but can be up to 3 years in storage in its dry form.
Mhm.
And it's actually an inactivated virus. So unlike the viral vector or the mRNA vaccines, it's inactivated COVID virus,
Okay.
which your body
Okay.
will gain the immune response to.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's been used in China as well for
Right.
emergency since last July, actually,
Okay.
under emergency licensing. But
Mhm.
there has been a lot of international hesitancy because of the seeming lack of data. And when you go online, you can find official websites for a lot of these vaccines. Like Sputnik 5 has a really nice set out English language and multiple language website. With all a lot of their trial findings and that sort of thing. But I couldn't find any for CoronaVac.
Huh. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, look, we know that there are multiple other vaccines in the pipeline, and what gives me a lot of confidence is that there are multiple vaccines that are coming at this from different angles. In other words, the array of weapons that we have in our arsenal is increasing, and if the virus mutates in one direction or another, we're likely to have a reasonably strong arsenal and a lot of options with respect to how to how it is that we can respond to that. So that's interesting. What I'm going to do, I just want to quickly talk, because we're probably going to end relatively soon, but I want to quickly talk about pregnancy and breastfeeding, because that's something people are anxious about. And then we can talk a little bit, if we've got time, about the delaying the second dose and the pros and cons around that. But let me just talk about pregnancy and breastfeeding quickly, because people read statements like the Pfizer vaccine, it is not recommended that the vaccine be used in people that are pregnant. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, Pfizer and Moderna have done extensive animal studies, and firstly, there's no reason to believe that either of these vaccines is going to be problematic if you're pregnant. So there's no theoretical reason, there's no kind of underlying concern that people might have because of the nature of the vaccine. From everything we know about biology, the expectation is that these vaccines will be safe and effective for people that are pregnant, firstly. Secondly, they've done extensive studies, certainly more. I think Moderna studies have been finalized. The Pfizer studies, they've got preliminary results saying that there's been no signals in animal studies that there's any problem for either the fetus or the mother with these vaccines. Now, the reason why they're saying that they're not recommended in pregnancy is that there isn't enough safety data for them to actually say that it is recommended. In other words, they're not recommended. They're not saying we recommend that you don't take it. They're saying we're not in a position to definitively make the recommendation that you do take it. We're saying we don't know. And I think that's part of scientific honesty. They're just saying at this point in time, we don't have enough data to say definitively that this is absolutely, definitely, safe in every possible way during pregnancy. But the expectation is that it will be. So how do we deal with that at this point? Well, certainly it's been rolled out and made available for people that are pregnant, but with very specific caveats, and these may differ from one country to the next. In other words, for the Pfizer vaccine, you might find in your country that they say something like, you have to have completed 14 weeks of pregnancy, and you can't be, and you need to be less than 33 weeks pregnant, and you need to have spoken to your obstetric care provider and weighed up the risks and benefits, because there may be people for whom getting the vaccine might be quite important. Weighed up the risks and benefits and had that conversation with your obstetric care provider, and then potentially you might be an eligible candidate to get vaccinated. As more and more data comes in, the expectation is that it'll become increasingly clear that it is safe and effective for people that are pregnant. And then the recommendation might be explicit that it's recommended in pregnancy. But there may be certain sort of constraints around that. So that's the pregnancy and lactation issue. Cale, any thoughts around that? Anything you want to add to that, or have there been any questions on that in the discussion?
Yeah, there has been a few on pregnancy and breastfeeding, and I think you've done quite well in summarizing that. That so far the human data just isn't necessarily there,
Yeah.
but it's theoretically considered safe. But a lot of people are asking about different autoimmune diseases, such as autoimmune diseases like diabetes type 1. Someone mentioned that in there. And just kind of any potential side effects, any lack of efficacy in that sort of group. I personally haven't seen any data on that, but again, the kind of theoretical scientific basis is that there should be minimal minimal side effects and risks to people in those sorts of groups. Do you know more about that yourself?
Yeah, and I certainly don't know of having an autoimmune disease being a criteria which would make you ineligible to get vaccinated. But you know, as is the case with Cale, I mean, you know, neither of us are your physician. I think if you have concerns and you, for any reason, feel that you might, you know, whatever your condition is, you feel that it may make, you know, not be compatible with getting vaccinated, then the thing to do is to speak with your physician, whoever your care provider is around that, and have a conversation, because that person will really be able to give you a really well-informed answer as to whether or not there's any possible problem with you getting vaccinated. For the most part, these vaccines have been demonstrated to be extremely safe. I mean, you know, I think, you know, we're the middle of January now, and I think over 8 million doses have been given. Might be more than that. You know, certainly 2 million doses have been given in Israel alone, and the safety and efficacy data that's coming out of these things is fantastic. There's been very, very few incidences of anything untoward happening. And in the cases where there has been, you know, there was an adverse event recently where a person who got the vaccine in December ended up having, about 26 days later, I think they ended up having a stroke because of, I think, a immune-related thrombocytopenia or something along those lines. I can't remember the details. But the point is, it's just might be coincidental that the person got the vaccine and that they were on track to having that event anyway, or it might be related to the vaccine. We just don't know. So the point of post-vaccination surveillance is that we keep an eye on these things, and we do this vigilance to make sure that we understand if there is any relationship between getting a vaccine and having any adverse event thereafter. We certainly know that it's extremely rare. You know, even in terms of you know, anaphylaxis and having an allergic reaction, it's been very rare. Where it has happened, it's been mostly with people that had pre-existing sort of allergic conditions, and there were people that had EpiPens. It is recommended that if you have a pre-existing allergy to any of the constituents of the vaccine, you know, then obviously it would be a bad idea to take that vaccine, and you wouldn't be eligible. So I'm not going to get into the weeds on particular conditions, because I couldn't really speak intelligently about that. Yeah, I think that's okay. The schedule, the delaying of the second dose. Let me quickly talk about that, and then we'll address any other questions that have been popping up. Delaying of the second dose. There is an enormous pressure on governments to get the vaccine out as far and wide as possible and get as many people vaccinated as possible. Here's where the tension is. Do you hang on to some vaccine so that you can give people that have gotten the first dose their second dose, knowing that once they've got their second dose, they will be 95%, you know, there's 95% protection for those people? Or do you hold the vaccine back? And it will, instead of holding it back, use up all of your vaccine, use up everything you can, get the vaccine out there, get as many dose ones done as possible, and just kind of believe that the supply chain will be such that you'll get enough vaccine in early enough to get the second dose of vaccine into those people in a timely fashion. So the one reason why doses might be that delayed is because of a strategy of like get dose one out to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, because we know there's an element of protection that they do get from that. So that, you know, it's now I'll tell you what the concern is. The concern is that we haven't done the science around this. We don't know after one vaccine how long the immunity that you have will last. In other words, at what point does your immunity start dropping off? We don't know that definitively yet. And might it drop off so quickly that by the time you get the second dose, it's kind of the same as just getting another first dose, and you might need another dose after that? I don't know. The other thing, the other risk that we run into is partially vaccinated people may translate into a reservoir within which there will be certain individuals for whom there is selective pressure for versions of the virus to emerge which are resistant to vaccines. We're already seeing, you know, the South African and the UK variant of the virus emerged much faster than we would have expected. The COVID-19 virus has got a mechanism within it that corrects for mistakes that get made in its RNA replication. Now, because of that, we don't expect the mutation rate in this virus to be very fast. And it certainly wouldn't be fast enough to account for the fact that we've seen 2 substantial variants, both of which require multiple mutations. So there was a little bit of a surprise, like how did that happen? And what we think happened was that there was individuals that might have been hospitalized and being treated in hospital that weren't well enough to mount an adequate immune response to the virus. So the virus was never killed, but medical assistance kept these people alive longer than they would have otherwise. And that gave these viruses an opportunity to exist in people for months. And because of that, there were enough replication cycles for multiple mutations to accumulate and these new variants to emerge. So that's how it works, more or less. That's the one theory. Now, might it be the case that inadequately vaccinated people have had dose 1 and a long time goes before they get dose 2, and in between, a certain number of them will get sick. And in that cohort, might there be selective pressure for a version of the virus to emerge that can resist the vaccine? So it's a gamble. And it's made a couple of people very nervous. Those are my thoughts. Any thoughts, Cale? Any thoughts, questions, concerns, comments?
Very concerned. Very concerned, just generally.
Yeah.
It's been a rough few months. It's just interesting what you were mentioning there. Anna in the questions has asked if you can contract coronavirus in between doses. I think that kind of goes along with what you're saying. Yeah. So
certainly.
If you contract the virus and you have a prolonged gap in between the 2 doses, we run the risk of wide-scale mutations.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, and you certainly can catch the virus between doses. So getting dose 1 is not a ticket to ride. Getting dose 1 is a stepping stone, but you're not home free at that point.
Yeah. And we've also had another question here from Comfort saying, are you completely protected if you're vaccinated?
Okay, firstly, Comfort, what a great name. Love it. Secondly, you're not completely protected. So these vaccines, we think they provide a huge amount of protection. And we think it's about 95% effective. Now, you can still catch the virus, you can still get sick. And we're seeing it even, people that have had COVID-19 once are very unlikely to get it again. It's very similar to getting vaccinated because your immune system has seen this virus before, so it can respond. But there are a small number of people that have got second infections. So we know that it's possible, and it certainly will be possible. And it's been shown to be possible, right? In the clinical trials, there were people that were vaccinated that still got sick. So it's certainly possible. The beauty of the vaccine is that if you get enough people vaccinated, there aren't enough susceptible people around. And the virus finds it so difficult to spread around that eventually the R value drops below 1. And if it drops below 1, eventually it'll just burn itself out and go away. So that's the reason why we're going for kind of as many people as possible. All right. Any other questions in there, Cale?
There's been quite a few. A few people have asked about the different approvals and regulations internationally, and a few people have asked about lower income settings and the kind of global distribution of vaccines and I guess equitable distribution that comes with that. And Greg, you have a lot of experience in this, I know, from your many years in global health work. So I'll open the floor to you.
So I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't know that. I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I think, and I'll speculate a little bit. Right. Most industrialized countries have got a reasonably sophisticated regulatory body that can take decisions about approving licenses. Within the EU, there's the EMA, which basically covers all EU countries. In the UK, which is just left the EU recently, they've got the MHRA, and they do the same sort of thing. In the USA, it's the FDA, et cetera, et cetera. There are low-income countries that don't necessarily have the infrastructure and the resources to do that level of scrutiny of new products to take a decision. And the WHO has got a feature called pre-qualification. And now, what I'm about to say, I'm going to say with the caveat that I haven't worked in the space for a long time. I was last working in this area about 10 years ago. So take what I'm about to say with a pinch of salt because it may have changed. But certainly about 10 years ago when I was working at the WHO, there was a pre-qualification program The WHO would do the same kind of function as the FDA and the MHRA with respect to ensuring that the trials and the data existed to make sure that a drug was safe and effective. Drugs would then be approved by the WHO, and member states, so countries in low-income settings, could use the WHO pre-qualification as a mechanism whereby they would then, in their own legislation, say, we're comfortable that this particular product is safe and effective to use in our country. At the time, I think it was mostly being used in the context of procurement through the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. So the Global Fund wouldn't procure any medicines that hadn't been pre-qualified through the WHO pre-qualification mechanism. It may have extended to other products like essential drugs. I'm not sure, but those are the moving parts that I know of. What was the second part of that question, Cale?
About the equitable distribution globally.
Okay, equitable distribution. So that there has been in industrialized countries, there has been a huge push to ensure and to promote the idea that rich countries wouldn't, and not all rich countries have basically abided by this, by the way, but I'm not going to call out specific countries, but most rich countries have agreed that they're not going to try to buy up like a disproportionate quota, and in doing that, starve the developing countries from any access to drugs whatsoever, because a few things would happen. Firstly, poor countries would never get vaccine because the rich countries would buy it all. And even in your own interest, you don't want that as a rich country, because the poor countries then remain a reservoir within which the virus will continue to seed back into your country. So you don't want that. We only win this battle when we all win the battle. The other problem with that approach is that you can get into a price war, and this thing becomes expensive for everybody. So that's a bad strategy. The right thing to do is to sort of say, let's try and get everybody vaccinated so that 20% of the population at least is vaccinated. That's the vulnerable people and healthcare workers. Let's get that done first. Let's try and get that done all around the world if we can, and then incrementally try and get everybody else vaccinated as well. The Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, they're not making any profit out of it, and they're making it extremely cheap, and it's a vaccine that can be transported easily. So in low resource settings, the Oxford vaccine is going to be absolutely fantastic. We need to guard against what's called vaccine nationalism. I think India recently decided to hold back on some vaccines that have been produced in their country, which were due to be exported, and they decided to hang on to them for their own domestic use. This could spiral out of control if other countries start saying, well, look, India's hanging on to their stockpile, we're going to hang on to ours. You could land up with again, kind of like a supply war. We don't want that. So we only really win this thing if we all win it together. To my mind, that's the only logical thing to do, and it's the only fair thing to do, and it's in everybody's interest to do that.
And that's kind of what the World Health Organization's COVAX facility is all about. So
exactly, that's the word I was looking for in my head. COVAX.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the COVAX facility is where countries donate a certain amount of money and kind of agree to this 20%. Every country should receive 20% vaccination before they go for large scale vaccination. But correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but like countries buy into the COVAX, but the COVAX still competes with European Union, US.
Yeah,
UK.
I think so. I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's there's still a small thread of vaccine nationalism there, but it's hopefully it'll roll out much better than expected and go quite smoothly. And
yeah, I think on the whole, there's a general acceptance of the fact that we need to we're in this together.
Definitely.
You can't. The day after Donald Trump got elected, I put out a video on YouTube, and in that video, I said, during the Trump administration, pandemics are going to be one of the major concerns they need to get ready for. And like I made the point that the only way for us to deal with pandemics is to work as a global community, that nationalism and looking inwards, and you can't build a wall to stop a virus. So that same sentiment needs to be repeated and repeated. Like, we only win this battle if we work together. Looking after your own interests is just not going to hold water.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, look, it's been exactly 1 hour. That's probably a good place to end. Are there any other great burning questions or anything else? Because we can also answer questions, by the way, in text. So if you put a question in that hasn't been addressed, we can log in, if it's on YouTube or LinkedIn, and put in a text answer, which I will try to do for questions that I haven't gotten to. But Cale, is there any last burning questions that we want to throw out there? Otherwise, we'll just kind of bring it to an end.
I think there's just too many. There's been a lot of excellent questions. I think the best thing would be to try and reply to them in time through text, because there's so many I couldn't pick out just the best ones. There are a lot of really great questions.
Okay, we're going to do that. I'm going to try and get on to YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook where these questions have been asked, and I'll see if I can address as many of them in text as possible. Thanks everybody for logging in. This has been really fun. First time we've done this. Cale, thanks for joining me. You've been absolutely fantastic. And I think that's probably it. You know what I'm going to do, just as a last thing, just as an experiment, because it's like the end, and we've never used this. I've never used this platform before. I just want to see. I think that there's a way that we can get the chat up on the screen over there. No, that does that. See, this is just us messing around a little bit now. But there's a way. I can't do it. Okay, all right. I was going to try and get the chat to be on this, like literally big chat on the screen. I think there's a way to do that, but I'm not quite sure how. Listen, thanks everybody. I'm going to push finish. You've been great. Take care. Don't do drugs. Always do your best.